So I've always kind of believed that conversations about generations, generational discussions that pit one cohort against another, are just fruitless. They're useless. Also, I don't like people saying "okay, boomer" to me. So I was a little suspicious of the show that we're doing today when senior producer Lily Tyson first proposed it to me. But it's growing on me. I mean, look, in a way, all this generation stuff is foolish generalization. On the other hand, you have to have some way of talking about ways in which different age cohorts are shaped, molded by the events around them and their own aging brains and bodies. So we're going to talk about all that, hopefully in a non-fruitless way.
Because we get around talking about my generation. Things they do look awful. Talking about my generation. I hope I die before I get old. Talking about my generation. This is my generation, baby.
That, of course, was The Who. I believe most of them, well, Keith Moon, of course, already passed from this earth. That whole hope I die before I get old stuff. It's one of the first ideas from your youth that you part ways with as you get older, most of us anyway. We're going to be talking about generations today. Obviously, that song is in so many ways so emblematic of a sense of impatience, generational impatience that was rampant in the land in, the late 60s, early 70s, a kind of rejection of the values of the preceding generations, and thin-skinned irritability about any judgment coming from those generations towards the sort of the youth movement of that moment. And, I don't know. I think it will be argued today, probably back and forth a little bit, that every generation does some version of it, that they may word it differently, and musically it might sound differently. But there's a way in which the past is prologue, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, all that stuff. So I'll stop babbling and begin to introduce the guests here. Here with us for the whole show is Bobby Duffy, Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London. He is significantly the author of The Generation Myth, Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. So, first of all, welcome to the show. Exciting to have you here. It's a great book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Colin. Really great to be here.
So maybe we actually have to begin with something as basic as a definition. I mean, what is a generation? We fling the word around. Does it really have a solid definition?
I mean, it's basically a way to segregate people on when they were born rather than their age at any one point in time. So obviously the terms that we'd be most familiar with is that baby boomers running through to Generation X and then Millennials and then Gen Z. And so it's these birth year periods of somewhere between 20 and 14, 15 years that you tend to group people together.
Right. And we should say, probably for today's conversation, we are talking about the four generations you just named here. The silent generation probably has some members kind of hanging on here and there. I think we're still working on names for what comes after Z or Z or Zoom.
Yeah.
But it's sort of those four that we're talking about. So notwithstanding the title of your book, I mean, you do explore ways in which it's useful to have these conversations, right? They shouldn't be maybe quite as all-consuming or all-explaining as some people want them to be. But what's the usefulness of talking about people in terms of generational cohorts?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, if I was trying to sum up the book in one sentence, it would be that generational thinking, splitting people into generational types, is a really big idea that's been horribly corrupted by terrible stereotypes, myths, and cliches. So there is something fundamentally important about when you were born, and it's based on a few simple facts, which is the well-evidenced facts that when you're going through your formative years in your teens and early 20s, what's happening then has a bigger impact on you for your rest of your life than things happening at other points in your life. We're more malleable, more open to change, all of those types of things. So There is something about when you're born shaping you, and we kind of understand that instinctively, that we're different from our parents and our kids are different from us because their experiences and context has been different. So there's something really useful and important, and in fact, I would say essential to understand society and how it's changing within that. But then the challenge is, the problem has been, we give these labels and then we attach lots of stereotypes to those labels that are, most of them are myths and real exaggerations of the reality, and that's where we get into trouble with these types. This type of categorization, when it seems that you can sum up millions of people in one adjective, like narcissistic or materialistic or selfish, depending on which generation you're talking about.
Right. It's my impression, but please correct me, that a lot of the identity that attaches itself to any given generation, some of it being fair, some of it being unfair, it really kind of happens that the cradle of it is youth, right? There's a way in which, we understand maybe baby boomers a little bit in terms of the Who and everything that went along with that. We understand Gen Xers in terms of kind of that 90s thing. There were just so many movies out at the time, like Reality Bites and Slacker and Singles, and so that sort of formed our impression. Millennials and Zoomers, they don't have too many other choices but to be defined by their youth. But there's something about that, right? That who you are when you're, say, in your 20s, that's how people are going to think about your generation, at least, not entirely, but in large part. Fair?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a lot of truth in that. And again, that view of generations as cultural identities that are shaped by their fashions and their music and whatever the zeitgeist is around that time is really important. But it also, generations is more useful throughout life, the life cycle of a generation, than that, in the sense that taking baby boomers as an example is, yes, they had that image of breaking from their parents and having more liberal, open attitudes. But also, when you look at the economics of baby boomers, that's really important in shaping them as a cohort as well, and has continued throughout their life. And it's not so much about those cultural references, it's more that they were fortunate enough to live through a period of economic growth, and where they could build up a lot of private wealth assets and a decent sort of economic position for themselves. And that is also defining of the baby boomers in some ways, that they've had that good fortune, good circumstances in which their financial position is quite different from the financial position facing generations that came after them in the US, the UK, and lots of other countries.
I'm so glad that you put it that way, because I've got a clip here I want to play. So if there's ever been a quintessential cinematic attempt to define baby boomers, I think it is the movie The Big Chill. And The Big Chill, it juxtaposes the two things that you just talked about. It's a group of people who've gotten back together. They went to college together during late 60s. But now they are in that moment of wealth acquisition. One of them is running a pretty successful sneaker or running shoe company, and one of them is working for People magazine. And there's a scene where they're sitting around the dinner table, and they're kind of talking about who they are now versus who they were a really scant period of time, a short amount of time before that. Gene, let's hear A1.
I don't know. I'd hate to think that it was all just fashion.
What?
Our commitment.
It wasn't. We accomplished things. All evidence to the contrary.
Now you're just taking a position.
Sometimes I think I've put that time down, pretended it wasn't real, just so I can live with how I am now. You know what I mean?
Nick, help me with these bleeding hearts.
I know what Alex would say.
What?
What's for dessert?
The kind of forced laughter at the end comes from a younger guest at the table, Meg Tilly, who's at least on the cusp probably of being Gen X, maybe not quite. But, Bobby, I would argue that every generation has a version of this, that notion of to what degree, if we do embrace the ethos that we had in let's say, our 20s, can we hang on to that? And to what degree do we begin betraying it? And one of the things that you talk about, one of the ways that we may stray from the paddock that we thought we were going to be in is just life events, right? Life comes along and you have to deal with stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That is such a good example of these competing effects on what shapes us. And So when I look in the book, I split it into there's three different types of effects that explain all change in society and us as individuals, how we develop. And that cohort effect of generation when we grew up, shaping us is one of them. But we've also got really powerful life cycle effects that pull us in a particular direction. It's like a current within the sea that pulls you along as it makes you change in particular ways that are kind of consistent, often consistent across generations. When you leave home, when you get married, when you have kids, when you get a job, when you retire, all of those types of steps pull us in a particular direction. That's where you see that pattern repeated, and similar sorts of angst about giving up our child or our young person ideals as we get older. That's kind of repeated through history. And then you also have period effects. The third effect is period effects. We are then also subject to big shocks that go on at particular times, at moments in time, like things like a financial crisis or a pandemic. They also have these big shaping effects, but we're all affected to some degree. So the thing that I try to do in the book, and the thing I think there's a useful shortcut for understanding what type of change are we looking at, is you just ask yourself, is this really about a generation, or is it about young people, or being a particular age or a particular stage in life, or is it because something in particular is happening across society as a whole? Is it a cohort, life cycle, or period effect that we're seeing here? And you quite often see the myths and stereotypes about generations are because they're ascribing something to a whole cohort that's going to stay with them for life, when it's actually, we're just describing young people, and it will be repeated again throughout history.
Yeah, so one thing that I say, in fact, I said it on Slack just a few minutes ago because people were telling an OK Boomer joke, and I hate being OK Boomer, and so perhaps defensively, but I do mean it. I said, really, my belief is that every time I meet somebody from Generation Z or X or a millennial, and they're kind of OK Boomering me or something like that, I always think, when you're 67 years old, which is how old I am right now, you will be less flexible, less open to new ideas, and less comfortable with tech than I am right now. Whatever the tech is at the time, it'll all be AI and robots, and you'll hate it, and you won't like the music. You won't like the music, and you won't think the people had any talent. And I mean, I think there is the kind of elasticity that we have at certain points in our life. Not everybody, because we are generalizing. I mean, it does begin to decline no matter which generation you belong to.
Yeah, no, that's an absolute fact. You're spot on with that. And in some ways, you'd be worried about a society where older people weren't uncomfortable with the change that they're seeing, because that would mean society isn't moving forward. We're kind of stagnating. If nothing is changing and making us unsettled, I'm sort of mid-Gen X, and I get lost on lots of new developments as well now. And there's a great Douglas Adam line about how things that new technology that you grew up with as before you were in your teens are just natural. They exist. Things that come through in your teens are exciting and a new development, and things that come after that are scary and wrong. And there is an element of that which is essential for society. It's not something we should be depressed about or worried about. We should be worried if we don't see that.
Right. I think, just to get to that life event issue, I think that's really important. In reading your book, I was thinking about the fact that, my son was born in 1989, and I kind of don't really know the 90s as well as I know other decades. I mean, I can rattle off the names of all those Gen X movies the way I did a few seconds ago, but I haven't seen a lot of them actually, because that happens to be a moment, I think, when you have very, very young children in the house, where there's a pull back and a turning inward. The household becomes itself much more important at a very kind of nuclear family level, and engagement with culture seems to wane quite a bit, at least temporarily. But you can say a little bit more about what the data says about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's lots of great data on how things like our engagement and our focus changes as we age, and you see it reflected in all sorts of ways. The U-shaped happiness curve is real. This sense that you've got you start off pretty happy in life, coming into adulthood, and then it dips all the way to. In fact, I think my exact age now is the very bottom of the U-shaped curve of happiness. I'm like at the bottom of this thing where you've got that pressure of youngish children and parents to look after, your own parents to look after as well, and careers and all of that stuff going on. And then the good news is tends to get better after that. You tend to be able to lift your head a bit after that and start to engage more in those interests and have that sense of greater fulfillment from that. So yes, these patterns of life cycle effects are incredibly consistent across different cultures, different countries. They've even found similar sorts of things among gorillas, where there is a midlife misery dip among other species, as far as they can tell. So there is something fundamental in we are pulled along these very powerful currents that have recognizable features across different times and species.
That also helps me understand something about Generation X, which is that, well, I mean, just to go back to the 90s and all those 90s movies and stuff like that, there was sort of a sense of who that cohort was that was conveyed by all that culture. Gene, we're going to drop down to A3. I'm just going to play this little clip from Pump Up the Volume.
I just arrived in this stupid suburb. I have no friends, no money, no car, no license. And even if I did have a license, all I could do is drive out to some stupid mall. Maybe if I'm lucky, play some video games, smoke a joint, and get stupid. You see, there's nothing to do anymore. Everything decent's been done. All the great themes have been used up, turned into theme parks. So I don't really find it exactly cheerful to be living in the middle of a totally, exhausted decade where there's nothing to look forward to and no one to look up to. That was deep.
So there was a way in which the message about that generation at the time of the 90s was that this kind of languid apathy and maybe some anomie and hopelessness kind of did define it, and that if you were going to embrace something other than that, you were going to have to make an affirmative choice to do that. Otherwise, that was going to be your default setting. And I wonder how you feel about that. And one thing that the U-shaped thing is really interesting to me, because I see Generation X right now as containing a lot of anger. Here in the U.S., these guys like Joe Rogan and Dan Bongino and Tucker Carlson, they're all Generation Xers, and they're really mad about something. Even the idea, the stereotype here in the U.S. of the Karen. The Karen is, this kind of transphobic and xenophobic and racephobic person who's probably the Gen X mother of Gen Z kids. So I don't know. Give me your take on all that.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm Gen X, and I've got some sympathy with them in many ways, because we're the sort of forgotten middle child of the generations. Everyone focused on millennials and baby boomers, and we kind of get left out. We got the cool name of Gen X to start with, but then we don't really get talked about very much. And I think there's a little bit of that middle child status that that shows up in those types of behaviors, because we kind of get lost in the conversation unless we get really angry and draw attention to ourselves, because we've got these cultural and demographic behemoths of baby boomers and millennials either side of us, with a little bit of blankness around us, and it's slightly different in different countries, the trend. So comparing the US with the UK, there are a couple of really important trends within that. Is in the US, because wage stagnation and the that sense of McJobs and dead end kind of careers kind of started a bit earlier in the US. You've definitely got these really big generation shaping trends in the US, where that sense of disappointment in not having the future that was promised to us, of going to college, getting a better job, paying off student debt, all of those types of aspects, that sense of disappointment does shape that disengagement in many ways. In the UK, slightly different. We had the stagnation, a bit wage stagnation, those types of economic declines slightly later. But what you see in the UK is actually, if you were trying to identify a suicide generation, or there's this incredible blip in suicide figures and drug deaths and things in the UK Gen Xers, and it follows them through life, and it's a little bit of a reflection again of being caught in the middle between two trends, where more drug use, more drug availability, worse economic prospects, but also not that sense of being able to open up about emotions and that connection to talking therapies and all those types of things. So we had this kind of squeeze on Gen X in the UK. So both different sort of circumstances in the US to the UK, but neither of them particularly happy positions for us as a cohort on average.
I came across this wonderful quote from a writer named Teus Dooland in an article in Vice magazine. Jaded Gen X slackers nihilistically accept the machine of which they are a part and can dissect its fundamental facile and evil nature with all the clarity and urgency of a 19th century romantic poet. And I think there is, for that generation, a kind of knife's edge down which it runs its thumb in the sense of, am I going to just say, well, reality bites, what am I going to do? I'm just going to have to kind of live in this fairly corrosive and debased world, or am I going to fight back against it? I sense the millennials and leading edge of Z are maybe a little bit more interested in fighting back than the X-ers, but how right or wrong would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is that aspect of that first generation, particularly in the US, that came through realizing that dream is kind of gone. I think that does hit them hard. I think what we've got to be careful of, though, is having that sense that we've got a coming generation that is going to save us or has a very different kind of mindset on this. And this is a repeated mistake in lots of generational work. There's a lot of books that were written about generations that saw millennials as the coming civic generation that was going to transform America with its incredibly high voting turnout levels and incredible political activism. And it's not really what's happened. We've always got this tendency to think, we've got these dual tendencies, either to think, well, simultaneously in our heads often, that the next generation of young people are either the worst in history. This is like a constant in our thought. We always think today's young are the uniquely wrong or weird in some sort of way. But we've also got this counter tendency to think of them as saviors, and they're going to have a much better character than us and are going to engage more in this. And Barack Obama does that a lot in terms of looking forward. He did that a lot and still does in his autobiography, looking forward that this is the generation that really believes in equality and is going to implement it, for example, or deal with climate change. And I think there's this sort of really interesting dichotomy between either really running down the next generation or lionizing them so that they're going to be saviors. And the reality is often in the middle. They're not as different. It's kind of a gradual change. So I think that there is definite truth in Gen X being the first to come into that kind of sense of really lost opportunity. But I'm not sure that there's such a positive switch going to be seen with coming generations.
The Obama stuff in your book is really interesting that way. And he's interesting too, just because he's really about as much at the tail end of the baby boom as you could be and still, make it under the wire. But yeah, that idea that he has that you cite where he even talks about, if you could pick any time in the history of the world to be born, you'd pick now because the rest of us are going, really? Because it doesn't look so good. Anyway, I could talk about this for a long time, but we have to take a break. I'm already in trouble with Lily Tyson about this. So let's take a break. We'll come back.
Insecure, I think that I'll die before I drink. And I'm so caught up in the news of who likes me and who hates you. And I'm so tired that I might quit my job, start a new life. And they'd all be so disappointed, cause who am I if not exploited? And I'm so sick of 17. I'm over this teenage dream.
Just in case anybody's hearing that song for the first time, boomers, you should know that Elvis Costello thought it was great. He wasn't troubled. He said that's the way music works. You just do stuff that sounds like things that other people have done a long time ago. So, but music is such an incredible trigger for this conversation we're having about generations. As Gina Amatruda, who's running the board today, pointed out, we went out with Neil Young, who's kind of in that song making some common cause as a baby boomer with the silent generation, although Neil Young is at full-on war with Gen Xer Joe Rogan and has said to Spotify, either he goes or I go. And it turns out it's Neil. Anyway, we're talking about generations with Bobby Duffy, professor of public policy and director of the Policy Institute at King's College in London, and the author of The Generation Myth, Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. Joining us now also is Justin Charity, a senior staff writer for The Ringer. He wrote the recent article, It's Time to Accept That Millennials and Generation Z Are the Same Generation. I should say that our third segment, I know our guest on the third segment pretty well. He's not going to agree with that. At least I don't think so. But first of all, Justin, welcome to the conversation. I mean, in a nutshell, if you can, make the case that you're making in the piece.
Well, basically, right, it's sort of a juxtaposition. If you think back as a boomer, for instance, and you try to remember how you felt about hearing NWA, right, for the first time, that's a musical shift, right? And the millennials have a similar musical shift, right? Of they single-handedly moved the capital of rap music from Los Angeles and New York to Atlanta, right? And these are sort of generational markers you might make if you're looking at things from the perspective of a music critic. And if you try to find a similar fault line between millennials and Zoomers now in the current musical landscape, I don't think there is a point of comparison. I don't think that fault line really exists.
It's interesting too, though, because and let's bring Bobby back into this. Bobby Duffy, as a baby boomer, I look at millennials and Zoomers. It's easier to say than Gen Zers, and millennials and Zoomers, and to me they are a somewhat undifferentiated blob. But I also wouldn't expect my opinion about that to matter very much. It's interesting to have Justin say something like this.
Yeah, I think it's healthy that your opinion doesn't matter. Just going back to that point before is we've had our time, and it's right for us to be confused or unattached to this type of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. It was a really interesting piece from Justin, and I can see that. I mean, I can't really. Such a bad expert on the differences between Zoomer and millennial music. It all sounds the same to me, absolutely. But then I'm not a music critic or cultural commentator on those types of things. And I just feel confused about. I can't see any difference, and it feels a bit of a mess of a scene right now. But that's probably how I should feel about that music, and maybe there's more gradations than I'm aware of. But I think absolutely culturally you will get these periods and patches where there's not much differentiation. Whether that means that we can then say that millennials and Gen Z are the same generation in a broader sense of broader cultural trends and then other social trends within them. I think there are quite distinctive characteristics between them in their relationship to technology, how they grew up with different sorts of relationships with technology, and then economically, very different contexts that they have been through, both not very lucky contexts for them. And then, I wrote a piece for the New Scientist on Generation COVID and the extent to which we're going to see how the long-term effects of this COVID experience, people that are going through this in their formative years. And you can see how that may be a key shaping aspect of both the education impacts and then the early career impacts on that part of that Zoomer group. So, yeah, I think I couldn't argue at all about the music scene. But it's much broader than that. There's much more to that generational definition and identity that's really where there are clear differences.
Well, I think also, Justin, I mean, just to stay with music for a second, music is a great generational marker. And I think it's also interesting because the younger the generation is, the more it's picking out music that they kind of hope older people won't like that much, so that they can get mad at the older people for now. I mean, like, my parents didn't get the Beatles. There's nothing I could say to them about the Beatles that my parents would ever have bought. They weren't going to do it. And ultimately, probably I didn't want them listening to the Beatles anyway. I mean, the worst thing that you can do in some ways if you're a parent, and I did this to my son, so I know, is to really learn a lot about his music. And so I don't know, Justin, how does that look to you? I mean, in a way, you could say that millennials who are still trying to be cool might have some incentive to try to figure out what Generation Z likes and then like it too.
I don't think that's necessarily what happens, though, in this case, right? Like Olivia Rodrigo is a great example of it, right? Where it's such an explicit through line, right? In terms of the influences, whether you're talking about grunge, right, which goes a little further back to Gen X, or whether you're talking about pop punk, like that's stuff that, millennials don't have to pretend to be into pop punk. It's the music that was on the radio when we grew up. And that's what makes it feel like such a disorienting conversation a lot of the time, is that I don't think millennials have to do much work at all, really, to understand what Olivia Rodrigo is about or what Lil Nas X is about.
Right. By other sense, though, let me just swing back to Bobby on this for a second, is that, and this sort of gets to what we were talking about right at the end of the previous segment, is that millennials and Generation Z do sort of make common cause in terms of rejection of the older generations in all the ways that we were talking about before. Our generations, we didn't do anything about climate change. We didn't do anything about all the economic problems that are kind of depriving them of some of the opportunities that we had, that they might have more in common just by not being baby boomers or older Gen X inhabitants than anything else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the broader social and economic circumstances for these groups does bring them together in some sense, in the sense that we really haven't turned around the future for young people. That sense, one of the most depressing bits of the research that comes out in the book is that in the late 1990s or early 2000s in the US and the UK, most people thought that the future was going to be better for their young people today compared to their parents. And that is now down to around a quarter of people in the US and the UK who think that that's going to be the case. So there is that sense that both generations have grown up coming into adulthood in that context of actually what's the better future, what's the brighter future here, and with no clear direction on where that's going to be coming from. And then the pandemic obviously not helping with that. So I do think, it's interesting in Justin's piece about the focus on the digital monoculture, that flattens things. I think that is really interesting when you've got communities and platforms where you can have lots of different groups of different age ranges and generations that are sharing the same sort of content. Is there a flattening effect from that digital monoculture? And then in the economic monoculture, you can definitely see how nothing much has changed. Certainly nothing much has got better for those generations. So there is those connections. Equally though, loads and loads of turf wars within and between generations. I just did a piece on how older millennials and Gen Z feel more connected than older millennials and younger millennials. There's fractures even within these groups where one end feels much closer to the other end, to another generation than their own named generation. So we've still got that sense of fracturing and identity, micro identities within these groups. But I do take the point that it's not really showing itself in these big cultural trends of a distinctive musical identity.
Right. I do think that the digital thing is really interesting, Justin. And well, actually, but let's back up for a second and just stay with music again for a second, just because your piece is so interesting that way. And I don't know. I'm one of these quixotic people who believes at age 67 that good music is good music. And I really like Phoebe Bridgers a lot. Of course, I work in public radio. Of course, I'm going to like Phoebe Bridgers. But, and I listen to a fair amount of hip hop and stuff like that. But I'm wrong, right? I'm wrong in the sense that I stumbled a few years ago across a Facebook conversation with a bunch of people from my generation, boomers, a little bit older than me, boomers, probably graduated around 1970 from a pretty prestigious East Coast college, and the conversation had started off by somebody saying, "Who is Cardi B anyway? And do I need to know who this person is?" And to my horror, I watched as person after person jumped on and said, you don't need, these people have no talent, doesn't make any difference, these people have nothing to offer us. And I mean, not only did it seem kind of racist, but it also sounded exactly like our parents talking to us about the Rolling Stones. And I do think there's sort of a way in which, these divides aren't meant to heal. I mean, in a way, you're kind of probing that with the Zoomers and the Millennials is, should the divide maybe even be sharper, or would it? I sort of still feel like it would be a better world if we could figure out each other's music a little better.
Well, I think that so drawing that comparison, right, the reaction to Cardi B versus the reaction to the Rolling Stones. One thing I think a lot about, now that I've talked to people after publishing that piece, is just there's a lost distinction here between generation, right, and age. It totally makes sense to me, right? It's totally sensible to me that there is a point in everyone's life where we just age out of youth culture. And Cardi B is very much an artist who has developed to appeal to the contemporary youth culture, right? And I don't think not understanding Cardi B is about the specific generational label or cohort so much as it's about, well, this is your age now, and you're kind of beyond the market for really any of this. And I think that's where, we don't even have to talk about just music anymore. I think if you're trying to have a basis for generational distinction rather than just, the kind of curmudgeonliness that sets in with age, I think web tech would be the basis, right? I think web tech is revolutionary. I think it makes for ways of life that are just unfathomable to people, of earlier generations. But I think where it gets a little bit ridiculous is when people try to kind of slice web technology into these eras, right? It's like there's the generation that grew up with the iPhone 4 as opposed to the generation that grew up with the iPhone 9. That's where it feels like we're being a little too precious and wanting to roll out generations with frequency of iPhone releases at this point.
Right. And so, Bobby, I had a similar thought. I agree with what he just said in that, to me, my perspective is blinkered by my generational place. But to me, the continental divide, the real kind of defining watershed thing between so-called generations really is actually the digital revolution. I mean, it was as profound a revolution in communication as Gutenberg was, as far as I'm concerned. And so where you fell on either side of that line, I think has dramatic implications. And now the people who didn't get digital culture at all are now in the process of dying out. But I guess an argument could be made that, yes, maybe not in that ridiculously finely grained way that Justin was just talking about different iPhone editions, but ways in which you have adapted to digital culture may be one of the real, in terms of those public events, those historical events, it may be one of the really, really big things, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's certainly important. But yeah, absolutely, I agree with Justin's point about this goes through all recent history of trying to name generations. There's supposed to be a Nintendo generation a couple of decades ago, where it was kind of any games console was going to define the next generation. It's not how it works. These are really small little micro trends that you're not really bothered about. But yes, the growing up with this type of technology is a really important aspect of it. And you can you go back to the real sociological and philosophical thinking about generations, and some of the founders of that type of thinking, like Karl Mannheim, a Hungarian sociologist, always put technological change at the center of generational identity development and the speed with which generations are formed. The faster the technology, the faster they're formed. He was really thinking, though, one bit of caution I would have on this is when he was talking about technological change, he was talking about control of the means of production, really, after the Industrial Revolution. So, yes, there's a cultural element to, are you a digital native or not? But the real generation-defining elements often have to have that connection to the economic, as in who's in charge, who's creating the value. And that's a really important part of this too, is how quickly older generations' skills go out of date. and become less valuable economically is a really important part of that connection between technological change and generational identity. So it's definitely a key aspect of it, but it's not just about the digital native thing. It's about AI, automation, and how quickly you can develop your skills in all sorts of things.
Right. And a lot of that is still to come. I mean, we'll be kind of figuring out as it unfolds. But reading your book, at one point I was thinking, wow, yeah, I mean, we're walking around with these things in our pockets or in our hands that have more computing power than what was used to send human beings to the moon. Mm-hmm. And you can watch Pornhub. And that really is maybe a game changer all by itself. Maybe it's the Pornhub generation. Anyway, Bobby Duffy's going to stay with us. Thanks to Justin Charity, senior staff writer for The Ringer. Say hi to Brian Curtis for us. He's an old-time friend of the show. It's time to accept that millennials and Gen Z are the same generation as his piece. We recommend it to you. We're going to come back. We're going to talk to a very bright young person from Gen Z. I happen to know because I used to be his teacher. Okay, some thank yous, starting with Gene Amatruda, who has stepped in here to run the board today. Gene is a person of considerable importance here at the company, but Kat Pastor was not available today, so thanks to Gene for helping out. Also, thanks to Jonathan McPants for helping us pull some clips and figuring out that pump up the volume clip was the way to go for the Gen X kind of defining statement. But special thanks to Lily Tyson, senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show. She is the producer of this episode as well. Bobby Duffy is still with us. His book, The Generation Myth, Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. Now joining us is Ziad Ahmed, the CEO and co-founder of JUV Consulting, a purpose-driven Generation Z consultancy that works with clients to help them reach young people. 1 year ago, Ziad was sitting in my Yale poli-sci class wondering why in the world he'd picked this particular thing to spend his waning college moments doing. But here he is, back on the air with me again. Welcome back. Good to hear from you.
I'm happy to be back on a Zoom screen with you. And no, it was a pleasure and privilege to end my college career on a high learning from you.
All right. So, I know you well enough to know that you probably agree with a lot of what Bobby's saying about generations being a sort of blunt instrument way of trying to understand anything. On the other hand, if there aren't defining characteristics to Generation Z, you're going to have to close up shop by late this afternoon, probably. So say a little bit more about that. How do you see the distinction?
I obviously think there's something arbitrary about how we define generations, right? And I think to the earlier discourse that I listened to a bit of, right? Like, especially given how rapidly digital innovation is changing, right? Like, there's a lot of arguments that generations should actually be smaller, right? Because how distinct we are based on the ways that we communicate are maybe happening on even more frequently than historically generations, and one generation sort of raising the next. But I also think at the same time, it's important, right, that we have this vocabulary to talk about the fact that the age that you were when certain seminal moments in society happen does impact the way that you move through the world, the way that you see yourself and the world around you, right? And I think it is important that we have vocabulary to empower a cohort of people who perhaps isn't always included in the conversation. And so when I talk about Gen Z, I don't talk about us as a monolith. I talk about us as a young demographic that often isn't included in the conversation that ought to be, because of our varied experience and because of how unique sort of life circumstances have occurred to us that have transformed the way that we move to the marketplace, through political spheres and beyond. I think that's critical to analyze if we're going to get a good pulse in the present or the future.
Yeah, there's so much I would like to ask you about, but in the limited time, I don't think we've said the word pandemic yet here on this particular episode, but it's time to say it, right? I mean, I'm in my 60s dealing with this pandemic in a different way, and basically discovering that people don't care about me. They say, look, it mainly only affects old people. Don't worry about it. But if you're in Generation Z, if your youth is unfolding against the backdrop of that pandemic, in a lot of the ways that Bobby writes about, that is probably going to define you marching forward even post-pandemic. Ziad, how do you see that?
Like I graduated from college in a pandemic, right? And the ways that my mindset has shifted, because I'm usually on this hamster wheel, the pandemic made me and my peers in this like year to just think and analyze. And we're now in this like state of like hyper existentialism is distinct from how this impacted my mom or how this impacted my baby sister who's 8, right? And so I think fundamentally, like when you look at Generation Z, our lifetimes have been bookmarked, right, by 9/11 and the pandemic. And in the middle, we've seen a financial crisis, almost continuous warfare, tremendous political and domestic, turmoil. And so our worldview, our perspective is shaped by those experiences and the age that we were when they happened to us, because our own sensibilities, right, were developed during these seminal moments, right? And so I think it's impossible for me to not think of the world and myself differently because of the pandemic, because the moment that I was sort of finding myself is the moment that the world discovered this pandemic, right? And I think that will sit with me for a long time and absolutely transform, huge majorities of my generation.
Yeah, Bobby, one of the things that I think that you've written about, and I think is really interesting too, I mean, as a white baby boomer, I saw a generation of white baby boomers who who I gave a lot of lip service to the idea of inclusiveness and diversity and embracing the plight and values of people of color. But by the time they hit their 30s, they really didn't know people of color. I mean, they were this big sort happened. They were living in mostly white neighborhoods, sending their kids to white schools. I see Ziad's generation really differently. They really are. Everything that they talk about, they also live with. And maybe I'm overpraising them, Bobby, but that's how it seems.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's a continuation of a trend that has started. But yes, absolutely, you're still moving forward in that sense of greater diversity and greater contact, and that's really important. That shifts attitudes and behaviours in a really important way. I mean, I do think we have to recognise there's been a long march to more inclusive, more tolerant attitudes that you can see across societies that older generations have moved along too. So I see it. The risk goes back to that Obama risk of seeing this as a break rather than a continuation of a trend, because the reasons are it partly kicks the can down the road slightly and lets older generations off the hook for not following through on equality. We sort of push it to this younger generation who truly believe in it and they can sort it out for us. But also it puts huge expectations on that generation. And a lot of the data that I look at in terms of attitudes and behaviors doesn't look like a clean break. This doesn't look like a generation that is going to absolutely break on those types of attitudes or behaviors around equality. It does look like it's a continuing to progress generation, but not a sudden revolution. And that's really important. We need to plan for that. We need to make sure the reason that you don't want to give that false sense of, it's all sorted now and it's just going to work with this new generation. We need to keep working at those the really important drives for equality.
So I'm just going to be cryogenically frozen. You guys figure it out. That's not a legitimate position for me to take. All right. So, Ziad, you've got about 60 seconds left. I assume you'd like to react to what Bobby just said.
Absolutely. It's important that we're having intergenerational dialogue, right, to solve the issues that we're trying to talk about. And I think that there is this sense of punting to the next generation to solve the problem. But I do think the way that we're going to approach the problem, because of the distinct lived experiences that we had in the age that we are currently, will impact our approach, right? And I think having these different approaches actually makes the solutions richer, right? And so I hope for a world in which all of us are working together to solve, right, problems like systemic inequality. But I think right now what happens all too often is Gen Z is forgotten in those conversations, and really we ought to be a critical part of it, because by punting, sometimes you divorce and separate and say, go solve it yourself, whereas instead you should be saying, look, Gen Z plays a critical role in the solution. Let's empower them at the table and let's solve this together.
All right, we have to stop there. So great to talk to you, Bobby Duffy. The book is terrific, too. The Generation Myth, Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. Ziad, great to hear you. All right, so we have to go. Thanks again to Gene Amatruda for stepping in, and, of course, to the great Lily Tyson for producing.